Hi guys, trying my third microphone today. Again, hopefully you've already read Chapter 2, Section 3 about biogeochemical cycles. If not, we're going to go one slide per page, and so you read the page before the slide. That way what I'm saying makes a little bit more sense. You can take your notes before or afterwards based on what you want to include. I'm going to change my formatting. I'm going to go into each biogeochemical cycle a little bit here, but for really in-depth looks at them, I'm going to make separate videos. That'll keep this video from getting overwhelmingly long. The likelihood is that they won't be up for tomorrow, though, or rather the first day that we're doing this, so you might need to wait a day or two. But that should be fine, because we're going to be spending a fair amount of time on them. Hopefully, by breaking up my videos a little bit, it can help you target your learning better. Like you might not need extra help on the water cycle, but you do want extra help on the phosphorus cycle. So you can focus on those particularly, and hopefully also a little bit more targeted for future study. All right, as mentioned, we're going to do our pre-reading, and our essential questions are: how do nutrients move through biotic and abiotic parts of an ecosystem? Why are nutrients important to living organisms, and which nutrients do which things particularly? And what are the biogeochemical cycles of nutrients, and how are they alike and different? We're going to start with generally cycles in the biosphere before we move too far. And that's our first page of the reading. It's the only main topic in this reading. All the other ones are subtopics as they are individual biogeochemical cycles. Let's start by breaking down that word. Bio means life, geo means rock, and chemical is the nutrients themselves. So these are cycles that move through different chemicals, and they move through the rock cycle, and they move through the life cycles, and in many cases also the atmosphere. When we talk about matter, as you remember from the previous video, matter can't be made or destroyed. We can swap what compounds different elements are in and which different atoms are in, but we can't make new atoms and we can't destroy atoms. So we have what we have and we need to keep reusing them. When we use the word nutrients, we are talking about compounds that are essential for life. There are some major nutrients that we all use, and those are identified in each of the various chemical cycles. No nutrients, no life. They're the chemicals that make our biological processes possible. That being said, they're not permanent, right? We break apart nitrates, and then we make different nitrates. We break apart water, and then we build new water. We make sugars, and we break sugars, and it's all cycled. So when we talk about these nutrient cycles, these biogeochemical cycles, please don't think that a single water molecule goes through the whole water cycle. One water molecule is likely going to be ripped apart and put back together with different, so that the hydrogens will get broken apart and they'll get put in with different oxygens as it travels throughout the world. Food webs, which we've learned about in depth, are the bio part of biogeochemical entirely. Right? If we're talking about how does carbon get from a plant to an animal eats it. It's the only way it works. It also works in that regard in terms of water. When you eat a watermelon, you get a lot of water in you. Your blood, your body parts, they're all containing water. And if something were to eat you, or you were to eat a chicken or something like that, you get a lot of its water in the eating of it. You get all of its carbon, you get its nitrates, you get its phosphates, you get the good stuff through the eating. If it wasn't for those lovely decomposers, though, all those nutrients and all those atoms would stay in our corpses. So we need our decomposers, our detritivores, to be breaking us down and returning it to the soil, moving it back into that geo part of biogeochemical. There's a lot of bio in the nitrogen cycle, more than just food webs. So we'll get into that when we get there. The nitrogen cycle. All right, but we're going to start easy. We're going to start water cycle. You've all probably heard of the water cycle for a really long time. But it's more than just precipitation, evaporation, condensation, precipitation, evaporation, condensation. Those are real. We do still see, we do still see that evaporation going up to condensation, That's still very much so a real part, and it will come back down to the Earth through precipitation. So that atmosphere and large body is still entirely normal. The ocean will evaporate, and then it'll condense, and then it'll rain down on land. A few things will happen once it gets to the land. Some of it's going to run off, and that runoff will end up in lakes or rivers, and then those rivers all flow down towards the ocean, returning into that cycle. Some of them are going to do what's called infiltration, and that means they get into the soil level. And once they've infiltrated into the soil, that's when they become available to our plants. And when the plants absorb the water, then a few things will happen. Some of the water will leave the plant directly into the atmosphere through transpiration. But some of that water is going to be eaten by our primary consumers and our herbivores. And then that water stays trapped. Also, the surface water, our rivers, our lakes, our puddles, can get drinking, can be consumed by heterotrophs. They would drink it up, and then it again enters that food web, that bio part of the cycle. Another way that it can leave the biocycle is through breathing. We breathe out water constantly. We take oxygen and we take sugars, and they go through cellular respiration to create carbon dioxide and water. So some of the water is going to be leaving at that point, and that's called respiration, which should be next to transpiration here. Can I put in text boxes? I don't think I can. Nope, no text boxes for me. But respiration should go right here. Yeah, we're just gonna draw like that and stop because that looks terrible. So respiration is also how we get from heterotrophs out into the world, into the clouds. Yay! At which point it again goes to precipitation, because clouds and condensation are the same thing. If the water infiltrates but doesn't turn into a river or get absorbed by a plant or drunk by an animal, it can go through what's called percolation. Percolation is when the water goes a little bit deeper in the ground, and that creates an aquifer. And I'm going to slowly write this out. Aquifer. Oh, it's so ugly. Aquifer. Aquifer is called groundwater. It's water that's underground. It's trapped in the little spaces between the rocks. Whenever you use a well or there's like a spring that's fed from the ground, these are from aquifers, and they're really useful for irrigating crops and stuff like that. Eventually, those aquifers will also flow towards the ocean, or they'll create a river which will flow towards the ocean, or maybe a lake which will get drunk and put back into our food web. That's all the basic. Very few things follow that evaporation, condensation, precipitation, evaporation. Some of it will, because it'll fall right back in the ocean. But as you can see, there's a lot more going on here. There's the whole food web bit. Water might remain inside the food web if it keeps getting eaten and that particular hydrogen and oxygen combination doesn't leave. Or it might get stuck in an aquifer for millions of years to come up into a stream just to go back into the aquifer somewhere else. Or it might always get transpirated and never evaporated. It's not really an actual cycle. It's pretty complicated. Or maybe an animal urinates and that water ends up percolating down into an aquifer. All sorts of options, okay? But rule of thumb, everything goes up to the sky. Transpiration, respiration, evaporation, all hits the atmosphere. And if it's on the ground, it's moving towards an ocean. Or it goes up again into the sky. Over here, I've got a number of molecules mentioned. In the last slide, we talked about the idea that water doesn't go through the whole cycle on its own. A good example of this is photosynthesis. A plant brings water up through its roots, and then it uses that water and it combines it with CO2. The outcomes of that are sugar and oxygen. Water didn't come out. Water went in, but then we ripped off the hydrogens from the H2O and we stuck them into a sugar. And then the oxygen was just released as oxygen. So that piece of water got destroyed and respirated out, breathed out back into the atmosphere. At which point, that oxygen will go off until it interacts and is breathed in by someone else. at which point the oxygen will be used to burn a sugar, and then the carbons will get attached to the oxygen, and the hydrogens will get attached to some oxygen, and then a new water molecule is made. And that's not the only thing. Hydrogens get transferred a lot. Water gets destroyed a lot to be used for its oxygen and its hydrogen. When we talk about water cycle, those atoms rarely stay in the form of water through the whole thing. And wipe the screen. Let's talk about the carbon cycle, and that's on page 47 in our books. It's labeled as the carbon and oxygen cycle, but as we literally just talked about, oxygen is heavily included in the water cycle. This is a good point for us to talk about the fact that these cycles intersect. When we follow a carbon atom, sometimes it's part of the water cycle with respiration or photosynthesis. Sometimes it's part of the carbon cycle. Sometimes it's getting attached to nitrogen. Sometimes it's getting attached to phosphorus. It really goes all over the place. So our biogeochemical cycles have a lot of intersectionality. They cross over a lot, especially in the bio part. Because once one of those molecules, one of those nutrients gets into an animal, that animal is going to use it, or that plant's going to use it and pull it apart and build what they need, and then that gets broken and built and decomposed, and it gets shifted around quite a lot. Compared to the other parts, our bio part, our food webs, are the fast part. Let's talk about why we need carbon. Because it builds everything. Carbon builds our fats and our cell membranes. It builds our cytoplasm. It builds our bones. It builds our DNA. It builds our carbohydrates for energy storage and structure. It builds our proteins. Protein, DNA, carbohydrates, lipids. Those are the four major macromolecules, and every single one of them is based around carbon. No carbon, no structure, no life. Again, we talked about photosynthesis and respiration being a part of the water cycle, and they're equally as important in the respiration in the carbon cycle. Both of those processes include carbon dioxide or sugar, and those are carbon-based. And that bio part is really big for our world. A good example of this is before plants, our sky was yellow and our ocean was green, because there was so much CO2 in the air and so much iron in the water. Well, plants started doing this photosynthesis thing. Make that green. Started doing this photosynthesis thing, and they took out the CO2 from the air and they replaced it with oxygen. And that oxygen interacted with the iron in the water. This is the geo part now, and that created rust and it sank out. And the oxygen remained in the air, and the carbon was then in the plants, and that started our food web. This is true in the water cycle, but I forgot to mention it. The food web is the fast part of these biogeochemical cycles. Right? A water molecule or a carbon atom might only stay in an animal for hours, days, years, but it could stay in the earth for a really, really long time. Right? Fossil fuels, which are part of the carbon cycle, have been there for millions of years. That's considerably slower than any carbon atom in your body, which was absorbed within the last 20 years, and will probably be decomposed and back in the cycle in another 100. So, especially if you get cremated instead of buried and preserved. So we have fast and slow parts. If it's in the ground, it's going to be slow. Right? Calcium carbonate, which is limestone, and the rocks that are underneath the ocean, which is a lot of it, are carbon-based. And the carbon that's locked up in those rocks is probably going to be locked up for billions of years. I mean, except for when we light those fossil fuels and rocks and stuff on fire. And then the slow part becomes the fast part, and we change the amount of concentration in the fast parts and in the atmosphere, causing climate change, causing all sorts of problems. Another place that a lot of carbon is stored is in our oceans, which are huge, and that's lovely. For a long time, our oceans have been storing carbon dioxide for us. So we've been burning these fossil fuels, and we've been putting CO2 in the atmosphere. But some of that's been getting absorbed like a sponge in our ocean, making more of that calcium carbonate we mentioned, carbonate, okay? But as our oceans warm up, they're going to stop holding that carbon dioxide for us, and they're going to start releasing it into the atmosphere instead. And the big oceans that were nice to absorb CO2 are going to be awful when they start emitting CO2. further exacerbating climate change. Anyways, sorry, kind of got on a tangent there. So the fast part is the biocycle, the food webs, and the respiration and the photosynthesis and the eating and the decomposition. The medium part is the atmosphere, because some of it comes out very quickly in photosynthesis and it gets added pretty quickly in respiration, and it's much more likely to come out of the atmosphere than it is to come out of a rock. And our rocks and fossil fuels are the slow part, except for when people mess with them. As mentioned before, all of our carbon atoms are going to get broken apart. In the same way that we blow up those water molecules, we blow up sugar. We burn sugar, which turns it into carbon dioxide and water, and that C6H12O6 molecule is no longer there. Now it's just CO2. And so we're pulling apart these molecules. The atoms remain, but we shift around the molecules. So don't think that carbon moves through all of these places as a single thing. I also want to put out that nothing actually cycles. I kind of mentioned that again in the water cycle. Nature's messy, nature's chaotic. It's not going to be this pretty thing. We can see a number of cycles, right? Here's a little cycle. Plant goes to animal. Animal breathes. Air goes into plant. Plant goes into animal. That's a nice little cycle, but it might also decompose. Or sometimes the plants don't actually decompose and they become fossil fuels. And then those get burned and then they go into the air. And then maybe it goes into the ocean. And now it's a rock. And it's going to stay locked up like that for a really long time. Sometimes the ocean also puts it back into the air. And now maybe it goes into a rabbit. And now, goes into a plant, into a rabbit. And then that rabbit decomposes. And it goes straight back into the air. Kind of messy. That's nature. It just does what it needs to do. Oh, the nitrogen cycle. The nitrogen cycle is easily the most complicated cycle we're going to watch. If I recommend anything, it's when I make the extra video for the nitrogen cycle, give it a watch. The whole thing's fast. Nothing gets locked up in rocks. The only slow part might be the atmosphere. But let's remember that the atmosphere was the medium part in the other cycles. Now, there's also a lot more bio going on here than before. First, before I dive into the movement of nitrogen through these cycles, let's talk about why we need nitrogen. In short, we need it for DNA, deoxyribonucleic acid. Nitrogen's a huge part. There's going to be 4 bases in DNA, and they're all based around nitrogen. Don't have those nitrogens, don't have DNA, don't have a lot of life. Likewise, nitrogens are huge in proteins. That's your muscles, that's your enzymes, that's your catalysts that allow your biochemical reactions to happen in your body. No nitrogen, no protein, no biochemistry, no life. Super useful. Okay. There's a few things we need to know. This term, NO3, this is called nitrate. I will call it both NO3 and nitrate. You just gotta keep up with that. Sorry. Yeah, that's super messy. Okay, so nitrate is NO3. N2 is nitrogen gas. I'm not going to write that because, okay, I'll write gas. Yeah, no one can read this. All right, so it's nitrogen gas. Up here, N2. That's the only place N2 is. And there is tons of it in the atmosphere. The atmosphere has 78% nitrogen gas. And absolutely none of it can be used by plants or animals. Because nitrogen gas is really stable, so it doesn't want to react with any of our processes. Fortunately, we have bacteria. Actually, we don't, but plants do, particularly bean plants, like peanuts and soybeans and stuff like that. They're called legumes. Legumes are the plants, not the bacteria. I have no idea what the name of the bacteria are. And the bacteria live in the legumes, the beans. All right, so this N2 gas comes down and it meets denitrifying bacteria, And nitrogen fixing bacteria. Okay, good. Nope, sorry. I gotta erase something. I misread my chart. I lied to you. No. Okay, sorry. So that N2 gas has hit some nitrogen fixing bacteria. Or occasionally lightning strikes the ground and it does that too, but really the bacteria, okay? The nitrogen fixing bacteria, if it's directly attached to a plant, like it is for our legumes, then the plant immediately absorbs the nitrates that it makes to build all of its cool plant things. Then the normal food web occurs, it gets into our rabbit, and then our rabbit dies, and our decomposers do their stuff, and that creates more nitrates. We're going to skip ammonium and nitrites, don't worry about it. And then those nitrates that are now in the soil go back into the plants, and then those go into the rabbit, which then go into the wolves and the coyotes, and then us, and okay, right? The animal, and then they decompose. We see that also plants will decompose. Gotta love the decomposers. Eventually, there are some other bacteria that do denitrification, and this is turning the useful nitrates back into N2 gas. That's how it gets back in the atmosphere, if you were wondering. So we've got bacteria creating nitrates for our plants. This either happens in the legumes or with bacteria and decomposers outside in the soil. And then those nitrates can be reabsorbed by plants, or they can go through the denitrification process and turn into N2 gas. Nitrogen fixation or nitrification, either one's going to be cool for us. There's a slight difference, don't worry about it, is going to make usable nitrates. Denitrification is undoing that process and turning it back into useless gas. I hope that made sense. Watch this part a few times. Great, moving forward. Okay, phosphorus cycle. What's a good color for phosphorus? I just want a brown, and they won't make brown for me. I guess we'll use pink for phosphorus. Why not? Phosphorus has no atmospheric component. Now we're on page 49. I forgot to say when we hit 48 with the nitrogen cycle. We're on page 49. Phosphorus is all slow. It's all rocks. No atmosphere. The only fast part is when we're eating it. Now that fast part is the same normal thing. Phosphates get assimilated into plants. Plants get eaten by animals. Animals die. Plants die. Decomposers turn the organic compounds that are plants and animals back into phosphates. That's phosphate, PO4. And then that phosphate goes back into the plants and it continues that delightful little food web that we've talked about. However, some of those PO4s, some of those phosphates, move through the groundwater, back to attaching that water cycle again that you saw there. Cycles frequently overlap. Anyway, so those move it into water, in which point it gets sucked up by algae and aquatic plants, and then it goes to the aquatic food webs, which are really the same. They're just about fish instead of about cows. Until eventually, some of those phosphates attach to carbon atoms and settle down to create rocks. Sounds like it's kind of done. And for a long time, it's going to be done because rocks are slow. But eventually, some of those rocks get pushed up into mountains, or they go back into the mantle of the earth and they turn into lava, and then they come out of volcanoes, and it's really, really slow. And so we get these new mountains, or these new lava flows, and eventually rain and water hit them. Again, that water cycle showing up to play, and that causes erosion. Right? You know that erosion is the breaking down of a rock to small little bits. Those small little bits are our phosphates, and they come to our soil to do the plant thing, and then they get caught up in the, oh gosh, I did not mean to make all those lines. Can I undo that? And they come up and they make all the fast biological processes, and this is generally in a pretty good balance. However, when we humans, yay humans, mess it up by adding artificial fertilizers that we made in factories and then dumped on the ground, that causes a problem. And that problem is called eutrophication. Is that mentioned in our book? Nope. But when there's too much phosphate and it gets in the water, then all of a sudden there's so much algae everywhere. Let's draw algae everywhere. Algae everywhere. Woo. And that covers up all the light and all the oxygen that anyone else could use. And when that algae dies, sad algae, its decomposition takes up even more oxygen. And then there's no oxygen for the fish or the invertebrates or anything else, and it kills everything in the water. Having too much phosphorus in our system is bad because the system didn't evolve for that amount of phosphorus. So again, when people get involved, tend to mess stuff up. Be very careful in the application of fertilizers if you're applying fertilizers to a large area of land anytime soon, which you're probably not. So again, phosphorus cycle starts at a mountain or lava that erodes, it gets washed down with the water cycle into the soil, or gets absorbed by a plant and eaten by animals and all that jazz, and then they die, and then the decomposers turn it back into phosphate, and then it keeps in that loop for a little while, unless it gets pulled by the water cycle again through into water where it becomes rock, and then it either goes back into the earth or eventually pushed up to become a new mountain. Phosphorus cycle. It's slow. It's really, really slow if it's not in the food web. Clean. And next slide. In recap, I forgot to write anything here, but the moral of the story is all in the beginning. The fastest part of every biogeochemical cycle is the food web. It's the bio part. It's where the most change happens. Otherwise, it's locked up in rocks, or it's locked up in the atmosphere, or ice for the water cycle. The food webs wouldn't work without the decomposers. They're what return the nutrients to the geological part in the soil, and then that can either move into rocks or back into the plants. No decomposers, all our nutrients would be locked up into corpses and poop, and that would be sad. No compound makes it through the entire process without being broken apart. It gets used in many, many different molecules, and then those molecules get ripped apart, and new molecules are made, and that's okay. Our cycles interact with each other. The phosphorus cycle wouldn't work without the water cycle. None of the biological parts, none of the food webs would work if all the nutrients weren't there because we wouldn't have anything living. Oh, phosphates are useful for making cell membranes and energy-carrying molecules called ATP. We'll learn about ATP later this year. That's what we really need to know. Oh, and they're messy. Not a pretty little round picture. A good cycle diagram has a whole lot of arrows. Like food webs, like all of nature. It's messy, it's chaotic, it's interconnected, but it works. I'll hopefully get those videos about each individual cycle up. In the discussion board, why don't you let me know which one you need first? I might even be able to find some pre-made videos by people like Crash Course or In a Nutshell or Simply Stated for you guys as well. All right, thanks for listening. Hope this helped.